Another important topic in analysis is the apples to oranges problem. Very often we'll see a survey compared to a previous survey result, but those surveys may not have asked the questions in the same way. They may have been asked by different organizations that get different kinds of answers. And how do we actually make an apples to apples comparison instead of an apples to oranges comparison is a lot harder than it looks, and it's also one of the areas that's most commonly misunderstood and misinterpreted. That can be due to question wording, it can be due to sample, it can be due to a variety of things. Let's just take one more example. Currently, the Rasmussen surveys show a significantly smaller level of approval of President Obama than the Gallup surveys do. Now, there are lots of possible reasons for that, but one in particular that goes to the apples to oranges issue is that Gallup samples the adult U.S. population every day, while Rasmussen samples registered voters every day. Well, what's the difference between those two? One really obvious difference is level of political involvement. Registered voters, by virtue of simply being registered, are undoubtedly more involved and interested in politics than is a sample of the full adult population. It's also the case that registered voters tend to be just a little bit more Republican than the population as a whole. So we'll talk later about exactly how much we might attribute the difference between Gallup and Rasmussen as being due to these differences in samples versus question wording or survey methodology. But at the very least, we can say from the beginning that if you're comparing an adult sample to a registered voter sample, you should expect some differences in the results when there is a correlation between the type of the sample and how that differs and the type of response and how that differs. So that's another example of a typical kind of problem that we'll want to address. A last issue that's related to this is the question of survey size. How big of a sample do you need to reach a particular conclusion? Now, on the one hand, that's an easy question to answer, or at least it will be once we're finished with the survey sampling part of the class. But there's a more subtle issue to it. All too often you'll see surveys of, say, 1,000 voters with a margin of error calculated at 3.1%. But then that same survey will report results for various subgroups within the sample, say men and women, or employed or unemployed, or whites versus non-whites. When we move to subgroups, the margin of error is different, and it depends on the size of the sample in the subgroup. To give you a practical example of this, recently a survey of the state of Wisconsin interviewed only about 450 voters statewide, which produces a rather large margin of error for itself, but then also produced or reported results for Republicans as a separate group. Now the problem there is Republicans make up somewhere between 25 and 30% of voters in Wisconsin. And so if the sample started with only about 400 respondents, then if it's presenting an analysis of only 25% of that group, only about 100 respondents, then I think it should be intuitively obvious that the margin of error for Republicans must be quite a bit larger than the margin of error for the sample as a whole. This is an example of utterly simple and straightforward mistakes that find their way into the reporting of surveys all the time. And those are some of the mistakes I want us to spend a good bit of time on in the parts of the class that deal with practical applications and implications and interpretations. Okay, well, that was a rather long introduction to the class, but I hope that I've covered the main topics that we're going to study over the course of the semester, the 3 weeks of this class, and I hope it gives you a sense of what the overall picture looks like. So we'll call that enough for this lecture, and I'll be back to you in a little bit whenever you click on the link to see the second lecture where we'll take up the next topic. Thank you. See you later.